For those that are watching this recording, I'm Eric Wilkinson. I am one of the 4 full-time therapists in Workplace Life Connections in UK's Health and Wellness Department. I am here today to speak on the topic of self-care for parents specifically. And I was thinking about, I always, when I do a new presentation, I always like to get into the research literature and see what's out there. One of the things I noticed, which I thought was very telling, is there is not very much research out there on self-care practices for parents, even though I think it's a very important topic. It is a topic that is starting to gain more and more attention, as well as the concept of parental burnout. And so those are things we're going to be talking about today. I designed today's presentation workshop with the idea of several times having you all write out things so that through the course of this workshop, you can get some, start to develop a self-care plan and get some insight into ways that you can care for yourself, either more effectively or ways that you can strengthen things you're already doing. So if you are someone that likes pen and paper, I would encourage you to go ahead and get some pen and paper. You can, of course, also just type on the notepad on your phone or any other electronic device. But this is designed with the idea of kind of being brainstorming and a brainstorming activity workshop throughout. There is also a fair amount of research presented, so it's a mixture of both. Here are our objectives. We want to understand what are some of the main barriers to self-care, particularly for parents. We want to connect to insight of what self-care means for you. So self-care is going to be different for every individual. And we want to start to either develop a self-care plan or move towards setting the intention of increasing our self-care behaviors, our self-care practices. I'd like to start with an activity. This is a spontaneous poem. Don't worry if you've never written poetry before, you're not a poet. But what I would like for you to do with your pen and paper or notepad on your phone is just to complete these sentences. So the poem starts off, I feel nourished. And then the next line is, when I smell, and it's whatever comes to mind. And then when I hear, whatever comes to mind. When I feel, whatever comes to mind. When I taste, whatever comes to mind. And when I see, whatever comes to mind. So if you can, go ahead and complete the poem. I'm going to give folks about a minute to do this. Once we do this, I'm going to ask those who are willing to share their poem in the chat to share in the chat, and Azetta can read those out loud. So just take a minute to complete this poem. Take about 10 more seconds, 10, 15 seconds to complete the poem. And then if you feel comfortable, go ahead and type your poem into the chat. And Azetta can read those out loud. I know this takes a little bit of courage, so I'm asking folks to be brave.
I'll let you know when some submissions pop up.
Okay. And I'm thinking about, and I will just do, I'm going to really do this spontaneous while people are typing. I'll just finish this poem myself. I feel nourished when I smell raindrops, when I hear the sounds of birds, when I feel seen and loved, when I taste blueberries, um, and when I see the sun shining through my window. That's my spontaneous poem. Anybody else be willing to share?
I see Audrey's in the chat, and she says, I feel nourished when I smell candles, when I hear giggles, when I feel a warm touch, when I taste home cooking, and when I see my family happy.
Oh, the taste of home cooking and candles. Love that. Thank you for sharing. Is there another one, Izetta?
Yes, there's Jamie says, I feel nourished when I smell the forest, when I heard the wind, feel sand beneath my feet, taste a grilled mango, and when I see my family smiling. And then there's another one by Cindy. When I feel nourished when I smell baking bread, when I hear symphonic music, when I feel warmth, taste chocolate, and see kindness.
Oh, I love that when I see kindness. So in listening to the, hopefully in doing this exercise or even listening to what others have shared, you can feel that kind of positive, sensory experience of things that just are worth tuning into and savoring. And so one of the things to note about this exercise is that often we move through our days kind of consumed in our thoughts or really in our mind. And so tuning into our sensory experiences, when we notice something that is pleasant, allowing ourselves to savor it is a very small self-care practice. But the idea of savoring things, of noticing things, if I see something that is, I'm on a walk and I see something that I think is beautiful, I'll just pause, even if it's just 15 seconds to be with that experience. So our sensory engagement is one of the ways that we can care for ourselves. In addition to just the joy of savoring beautiful and wonderful things and things that taste and smell good, in addition to that, it also communicates to our bodies that we're safe. It allows us to kind of take a breath and calm down, which again is another important small self-care practice. Thank you for those that were willing to share. Okay, so let's kind of get into the definitions. What is self-care? Self-care is understood as engaging in behaviors that sustain a person's health and well-being and prevent burnout and illness. That's kind of a global definition. Self-care can be understood as taking care of major domains of the self. So that means taking care of our physical needs, our emotional needs, our cognitive or psychological needs, our relational or social needs, and then our spiritual and meaning-making needs. And for each one of these, there's an example that's listed there. Let me give you just a second. If I go into trying to move stuff around, I suddenly lose connection with my PowerPoint. So there we go. Okay, I'm back. So one of the things I always like when I do a self-care presentation, I think it's important to note the difference between ourselves and the stories we tell about ourselves. So the self, what the self is listed over on the left. The self is created by our mind. It's a way of organizing our experiences and engaging with the world. The self contains what is, meaning what's present with our experience, what's becoming, and it also contains our potentials, what can be. The self is constantly emerging, moment to moment. So every time we're interacting, every time we take a breath, every time we're consciously awake, the self is emerging in that experience. There are parts of ourself that are changing with the situation. So I can move from being bored or interested or curious or feeling restless. I can experience the self indoors or outdoors. There's lots of fluid aspects to the self. And then there's also stable aspects, parts that tend to be consistent over time. The self establishes a boundary between ourselves and the external world. It exists in relationship to others. So much of what we know about ourselves is what others teach us about ourselves. Um, we only know we're a parent in relationship to our children. The self is a way of knowing who we are, our capacities, the different parts of ourselves, our inner resources. It's a way to connect the past to the present and the future. And there's different ways of relating to the self, including self-care, self-kindness, also self-criticism or self-aversion. Some others are listed like self-compassion, self-love. Again, selfing is more the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories of me, myself, and I, which are never, fully complete. There's not, we could have all the story time in the world, and we wouldn't be able to completely narrate who we are. So it's an important difference because in this presentation, we're not going to be talking so much about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are in our lives. We're going to be focused more on the actual self that exists in the present moment. Okay, let's see here. So here are some specific challenges for parents. Many of us were raised in families and cultures that taught us that caring for other people is noble or virtuous, but thinking about ourselves or caring for ourselves is selfish. Many of us did not have good adult role models for self-care. So I can think in my own life, I had, my dad worked most of his adult life for IBM, worked really hard, was really engaged in his kids' lives. But I didn't see a lot of examples of daily self-care. Now for him, self-care was he liked to take karate classes and other martial arts classes. So there was some examples of his self-care, but I didn't see it on a daily basis. My mom, part of growing up was a stay-at-home mom. Part of growing up worked in human resources for the hotel industry. Again, she was very caring and nurturing. It was very rare for me to see my mom do something that I could say that's just for her. For her, like I'm old enough to say one of her forms of self-care was she liked to watch Remington Steele on TV was a form of self-care. But the point is that many of us did not have really strong role models when we were kids of what it looks like to care for ourselves as adults. Also, we often embrace cultures of both overworking and self-sacrifice. In other words, within our work culture and just within our general culture, working hard is a value many people hold. And in some ways, there's often a competition to show that I'm working harder than everybody else. There's also this value for sacrificing our own needs, that this is held in high esteem. And these things can discourage us from practicing self-care. Since the 1980s, there's been shifts within our broader society, within our labor market and economics that have also resulted in shifts in parenting. And so there has, going back over the last 40 years, there's been increased pressure on parents to engage in what's called positive parenting, which involves nonviolent, warm, supportive, and sensitive parenting. And here's the kicker, all the time, right? We're supposed to be on all the time. We're supposed to be warm and supportive, patient, in tune with our kids all the time, which is very demanding. There's also been exponential growth in parenting research and education. We're constantly being bombarded with both in like popular news media and social media, as well as in kind of more academic research with studies and stories about what it means to be a good parent. And for many of us, being a good parent and what we are learning as good parenting is often different than what we experienced when we were kids. So there's a lot of, it almost feels like endless learning, which also can lead to endless criticism of our parenting. The expectations for what it means to be a good parent are higher than ever before, and this often results in frustrated idealism for most parents, feelings of failure or inadequacy, that I'm not able to meet the expectations that I hold for myself and that the broader society holds for what a good parent looks like. In addition to these kind of increasing demands and expectations of what positive parenting entails, we've also seen that both parents' schedules and their children's schedules have become busier over the last 40 years. People are working more hours than ever before. There's less separation between, home life and work life. This can be very demanding. Before the pandemics, especially, kids were often had more scheduling in their lives than ever before. We see this even within school systems that do away with things like recess, because it's not seen as like an important event. So we have to schedule and maximize every hour we have in the day. There's also less control. Parents have less control over the socialization and the cultural messages that their children receive. And so all of this makes for a very difficult situation, in many ways more challenging than it was back in the 1980s. These challenges can result in feelings of guilt and shame. And in this presentation, references guilt-free self-care, which is, a clever little hook maybe for somebody that would say, oh, I'd like to experience some of that guilt-free self-care. My experience is that often the most caring parents experience strong feelings of guilt about their parenting. I'm curious if anybody in the chat would be willing to express a thought about why very hardworking, caring parents often experience guilt. I think we have something in chat. Are you able to read that?
I typed in the comparison trap. I don't see anyone else. Oh, I see another one now. So I put in a comparison trap. And then Erica put in, I feel guilty that I have to work and can't stay home with her. Someone else said, because by taking care of ourselves, we are not spending time on the kids, family, and maybe harming them, or we think we're harming them. Someone else said, we set high standards for ourselves. Another one said, hard time balancing career and time with children.
Yeah, I think you are totally have your finger on the pulse, right? There's a sense often that we have to choose between work and our kids, or we have to choose between ourselves. There's often this kind of either or mindset that we have. One of the things I would encourage you to think about with self-care is it doesn't have to be either or. In fact, I would argue that it usually is both and. That when we care for ourselves, that actually enhances our ability to care for ourselves and for others. But we do often feel like we have to make choices, and that we may be making the wrong choices. As Etta mentioned, comparisons. There's also, we do live in an era where we're constantly comparing ourselves, or constantly seeing ways that we could be doing things better. And we draw these discrepancies between how we are parenting and how we think we should be parenting. And every time we start to draw like a discrepancy between what we're doing and what we think we should be doing, it creates stress and suffering, and often guilt can arise. So guilt is just the feeling that you've acted or done something wrong. Example of not spending enough time with your kids, which is one of the things folks mentioned. Guilt usually arises when we think about how our actions are impacting others. If we conceptualize self-care as a selfish behavior that negatively impacts our kids, then we're going to feel a lot of guilt if we go to practice self-care. Shame is a little bit different. It's related to guilt, but shame is this stronger feeling that we're bad, or we're bad parents. Shame is a feeling that we often have towards ourselves. This feeling that like I'm bad, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not a good parent. So in thinking about, these are things that are, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge these are things that almost every parent I work with experiences. They're widespread, they're common. And it's important to remind yourself that strong feelings are almost always connected to important values. So if we, back to my point about some of the most caring and hardworking parents feel the most guilt, these parents often really place a lot of importance on being there for their children, of being good parents, of being loving and kind. A lot of parents will say, I want to do better than my parents did when I was growing up. So it's really connected to the strong value we have on family or on nurturing like vulnerable children, caring for vulnerable children. When we notice that these feelings arise, it is a source of information and we can become curious about the feeling. We don't have to like, first of all, we don't have to believe the feeling. Our feelings are just information. Doesn't necessarily mean they're true. We often feel guilty when we're not guilty, or we feel like we're failing when we're not failing. So we can ask ourselves, first of all, what am I feeling? Like, let me name it. And then what am I believing about the situation or myself? When we ask ourselves these questions, we start to create a little bit of space between ourselves and the feeling. And we might realize, and we could even connect it back to the values. Okay, I'm believing that I need to prioritize my child over everything else. And then if we were to acknowledge that to ourselves, then we also might ask ourselves, is this reasonable? Is this a realistic expectation that in all circumstances, I'm always thinking about my child or putting them first? Um, are there times when I have to prioritize other things? It might be that I'm believing that I'm not patient enough with my child or that I don't listen well enough. So that again, that connects back to these values of it's important for me to be patient and to listen. So what am I believing about the situation? What am I believing about myself? Once we notice what that is, we can ask ourselves, is what I'm believing realistic? Is what I'm believing reasonable? Would I put these same expectations on other people? We can also just remind ourselves, I'm feeling this because my children are important to me. And if we acknowledge that, if we acknowledge the connection to the value, then all of a sudden it actually kind of changes how we feel about it. It comes back to a more positive thing. Self-compassion practice, and to quickly define that for you, self-compassion practice is to notice when we're suffering or experiencing some unpleasant feeling, to name it like I just modeled, to say, okay, there's some feelings of guilt here, or there's some feelings of shame. So it's to notice when we're suffering or notice when we're experiencing some difficult emotion. It's then reminding ourselves that we're not the only ones that feel this way, that other parents feel this way too, that I'm not alone in what I'm feeling. In fact, that this is part of being parenting, part of being a parent. Like parents feel these things. That's remembering that we're not alone and that other people go through this too. And then finally, the last part of self-compassion. First, you notice that there's some kind of suffering or pain or emotional problem. Then you remind yourself that I'm not alone in feeling this, that other people feel this way too. Is then to respond to yourself with some warmth and kindness, to say to yourself, like, this is really hard right now, or you're doing the best you can. I can see how important it is to you to be a good parent, to respond with that kind of warmth that you would give to a friend. When we do these things, we're actually able to transform the feelings of guilt and shame. It doesn't mean they completely go away, but what it means is that we start to broaden our experience. We bring in some warmth and kindness that can coexist with the feelings of guilt. We can start to understand, where is this coming from, and connect it back to our values. I put in here the idea of being guilt-free means that you first must experience guilt. So in order to practice guilt-free self-care, you have to allow yourself to acknowledge guilt, make space for that feeling, become curious about it. When you do that, when we don't try to push the feeling away, then we can start to make decisions and engage in self-care behaviors that exist outside of feelings of guilt. Other things you can remind yourself that really help are, remember that you can remind yourself that when we nourish ourselves, we have more to give to others. It's really important. If we don't get enough sleep, if we're not eating healthy, if we're not experiencing positive emotions, it is really hard to be caring towards others or have the energy to give towards others. So self-care allows us to sustain caring for others. When we care for our physical, emotional, psychological, social, and spiritual health, it improves our interactions, the quality of our interactions. A lot of times parents will talk to me about how they feel like they don't have enough time, and they're really focused on kind of the quantity of interactions. I will usually remind folks that, like, if I go and do a workout at the gym, I am much more pleasant to be around. So if I go do a 30-minute workout at the gym, or if I go for a 15-minute walk and then I come interact with my family, I'm more relaxed. I'm more present. I'm more regulated. I'm just the quality of the interactions improves. And finally, we can remind ourselves that our needs matter too, that we matter too, that it's important we bring ourselves into the circle of compassion or the circle of love. Yes, we want to love other people and be compassionate, but we need to bring ourselves into that circle of compassion and love. A simple way of remembering this is that my needs are not more important than others, but they are as important. And so when we remind ourselves of that, we also recognize we don't have the same needs, right? Our children have different needs that we have. So it it doesn't mean that we necessarily will spend the same time addressing our needs as others because our needs are different. It just means we acknowledge that they're as important as others. I'm going to pause just a second because I have a little dog here that's about to start barking at me. So I'm going to put him in a different room so he doesn't interrupt with the presentation. So we'll do a 20-second pause and I'll be right back. All right, that's my little Yorkie named Cujo, who sometimes lives up to his name. All right, I just put this in here because I think it's important. This is probably seems intuitive, but based on the research that is out there, parents describe self-care as taking care of their physical and emotional needs. It means exercising, it means engaging in pleasurable activities, getting rest, asking for help, getting help, which is hard for a lot of parents. A lot of parents worry about the well-being of their children if they have other people provide help. A lot of parents feel like it's an indication that they're failing at being a good parent if they ask for help. The reality is, as human beings, we all need help. And so the ability to ask for help is a form of self-care. Planning is really important. I don't, you probably all already know that very well. Lowering expectations. What I would say is developing more realistic expectations of what good parenting looks like. It is not perfection. It is not always being patient. It's about like creating stability and safety. It's about modeling good behaviors. It's about listening to your children, but it's not about perfection. Making time for yourself. I highlighted this in bold. Free time, which is often what many of us, we just kind of, as soon as life gets busy, we kind of just eliminate all our free time. We just say, well, I'm just going to work, work, work all the time. Free time is needed to escape from stress. It's needed for personal growth. It's needed to develop creative thinking, and it's needed to enjoy life. Free time is as important as like eating healthy and getting enough sleep. If we don't give ourselves free time, we won't be able to like release stress. We won't be able to grow as a person, and we won't be able to connect with all the wonderful parts of our life. Obstacles to parental self-care tend to be varied, but the ones that are most consistent is limited time, limited money, and social support. It's also hard for a lot of folks to accept help, and there can be difficulty setting boundaries. Particularly, a lot of moms out there really struggle with setting boundaries where they say, I'm going to set aside some time for myself. A lot of moms embrace kind of an ethos of self sacrifice. And while self sacrifice is needed, most definitely at times as when we parent children, if we self-sacrifice all the time, it's really not sustainable. And it also is probably not, modeling the behavior that we hope our children embrace as they move through this world. In 2017, there was a study released where they surveyed parents, and at that point in time, 12.7% of parents met full criteria for burnout. And so burnout here there's 4 components to it in terms of parental burnout. There's this idea of contrast, which kind of gets at what Azetta referenced earlier. Contrast is where we start to notice a discrepancy between the parent that you are and either the parent that you used to be or the parent that you aspire to be. I think about a lot of parents I work with that will comment on how they wish they could be the parent they were when they were younger, or they wish they could be the parent they were when they had less kids, or they wish they could be the parent they were when they had a less demanding job. All of this can create feelings of burnout. There also can be this comparison about who we think we should be versus who we are. Saturation, this is this feeling of being fed up with parenting. It's like, I just can't do this. I can't do anymore. I am at my limit. That's what saturation is. That's a sign of parental burnout. Distancing is an inability to do anything outside of routines. So this is feeling like really trapped, like my days are scheduled for me now until forever. And I can't really step outside of all these schedules and routines. That can definitely, it can be a symptom of burnout. It can also lead to burnout. And then the most salient example of burnout is just feeling exhausted. It's this overtiredness with the parenting role. Here I've listed some risk factors for burnout. You can look at them. I'm not going to read through them all. But I did highlight, and one of the things I'll note on there, I will point out, so first of all, mothers do tend to get burnout more than fathers. But having said that, fathers who put in effort into their fathering, in other words, they are really invested in establishing a healthy work life, work-family balance, that they're really concerned about being good parents. Fathers who are invested in being good fathers, they experience burnout just as much as mothers do. I put 3 of them in bold because if we think about the last couple of years with the pandemic, I think all of those things have really been, all those risk factors have really been elevated. We know that in the families I work with and just, direct experiences that kids in and out of school, kids, doing schooling from home, lack of childcare, inconsistent schedules, worries about kids getting sick during the pandemic. All of these things have really led to higher stress levels. And that's not even getting at the stress we experience from our own fears of getting sick, or the fears of our parents getting sick, or the changes in work. We know that during the pandemic that, for a big portion of it, we are often isolated. And so there was less social support. And while we're engaging with people more often these days, we're probably still not back to the same level of social support that we had before the pandemic. So we know that when parents feel isolated or alone, that this puts them really at risk for burnout. And then, of course, just having a major pandemic that with lots of people dying, that kind of raises everybody's anxiety. So those are the risk factors. If we look at the bottom, it's really important to know what are the protective factors. So social support, this is it can be your partner, it can be extended family, it could be friends, it could be parenting groups. Having other people that can provide you both emotional support, just in terms of your own needs, but also can provide hopefully some social support in terms of caring for your children. Emotional regulation, the more we're able to kind of care for our own emotions, the less likely we are to get burnout. Self-care behaviors, the more self-care behaviors we engage in, the less likely we are to experience burnout. And then finally, this idea of self-compassion that I referenced before, that as we become more compassionate towards ourselves, we also become more resilient. Let me reconnect here. I included this slide just for those who would be interested in measuring their own parental stress levels. Zeta will send out this PowerPoint. There's a link here where you can do this 18-item survey and kind of see where your stress score is. Stress scores range between 18 and 90. I've indicated on there that the average stress score for a parent with a child who has behavioral disorder is 43.2, and the average stress score for parents that have children without behavioral disorders is about 37.1. So those are the averages. If you want to click on that, you can kind of see where do I fall in terms of my stress levels and how, and then also in terms of the mean of either 43.2 or 37.1. All right, so I'd now like to do another exercise. So again, if you are someone likes paper or pen, go ahead and get that out, or grab an electronic device that you can write on. And I first want you to just, this first part, you can even close your eyes if you want to do some reflection. That sometimes can help. So if you feel comfortable, like closing your eyes, dropping into your body, I want you to imagine that you're far into the future, and that you're sitting in a beautiful, lovely garden. And you're towards the end of your life, and you have this downtime to kind of look back on your life. And you feel deep satisfaction. You feel fulfillment, sense of contentment, despite all the hard things that you've gone through in life. Despite all the challenges, you have this deep sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. And then ask yourself with your eyes closed, what were the deep needs that you fulfilled? Were they needs of family, nature, growth or adventure, creativity, deep needs of friendship, deep needs of being loved, knowledge? As you look back on your life and it's been fulfilling, what are the deep needs that you have fulfilled? What stands out to you? And this is really an intuitive thing of just seeing what rises to the surface for you. And then ask yourself, to what extent are you currently meeting your needs for happiness? Ask yourself, is your life out of balance in any way? Are you spending too much time meeting others' needs? Are you too busy to attend to or care for yourself? To what extent are you currently meeting your own needs? In what ways does your life feel out of balance? And then open your eyes and write down, this is just for you, we're not going to share these, but write down any way that you feel like you're unfulfilled in your life right now, particularly as it relates to these really deep, important needs. In addition to the needs that I listed here, it could also be the need to be seen or to be heard, to be respected, the need to feel safe or secure. Write down any way that currently your needs are unfulfilled, these really deep, important needs. It could just be the need for more free time. And after you do that, I now want you to ask yourself, what external or internal obstacles are getting in the way of meeting your needs? So example of external obstacles are not having enough money, not having enough time, could be not being in a relationship, or it could be family problems. What external obstacles, could be work, are getting in the way? Or what internal obstacles? And internal obstacles include like um, feeling unworthy of caring for yourself or seeing it as something that's selfish. Maybe you're not meeting your needs because you're afraid of failing. If I try something that's important to me, I might fail. When you have a sense of what obstacles are in the way of your unfulfilled needs, write down any actions that you can take to overcome the barriers to meeting your needs. So any actions you can take to meet your needs. Sometimes there's things that we can't really change, that there are barriers that are just there. So see if you can make space for the reality that we can't always meet our needs. And see if you could even write yourself some encouraging words about our and your human limitations. Any kind of words of acceptance that this is just kind of what it is right now. And this is, I just can't, for this reason, I'm doing the best I can, but I can't fully meet these needs. See if you can accept that this is what it is. This is part of being human, that we all have limitations and we also have things in the world that put limitations on us. It might be that, work is just really demanding right now. And while I'd love to be home all the time with my child, that's just not an option for me. So any words of acceptance. It could even be stating something like, I'm doing the best I can, and that's good enough. And then finally, I want you to think about, are there any creative ways that you can meet your needs that you haven't done before? Anything you haven't tried before or done before? Is there anything small that you can do to meet your needs, even just partially meet your needs? So I used the example earlier that for me, going to the gym for 30 minutes or 60 minutes is great. But there's lots of days where I have limitations and I can't do that. So maybe I can partially meet my needs by going for an extra 10-minute walk. Creativity is one of my big needs. There are days when I have some free time and I can do some creative writing. There's other days where I don't have either the time or the energy, but maybe I can read something that's inspiring. Or maybe I can just jot down a couple notes of something I want to write about later. Are there any small ways that you can even partially meet your needs? Write those down, tapping into your creative energy. And with the things you've written down, these can then become specific SMART goals if you want them to, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-oriented. You could come up with the SMART goals. You could also just set the intention that I'm going to do more of this. I'm going to go for more walks, for example. Or I may not have a lot of time for creativity, but I'm going to, listen to a song I like and sing along. Throw myself little 5-minute dance parties. Self-care is rooted in discipline and integrating self-care practices into our daily lives. We want to make our self-care practices and behaviors habits. We want it to be like, I brush my teeth and then I go take a walk, or I eat lunch and I eat lunch outside because I like nature. It might be that, all right, I'm too tired to watch a basketball game, but I recorded the basketball game and I watch it when I have some downtime. The idea of the more things that you can integrate into your daily life, the better. We want to have these little moments of self-care. So we like the big moments where we can go on vacation or we have a couple hours to ourselves, but even just like building in like 5 or 10 minutes, this really goes a long way in terms of improving the quality of life and caring for ourselves. As we think about self-care planning, and I'm going to give you just, I know we're coming up towards the end of our hour. What I would encourage for you to do is just to jot down these different categories. And then to think about, and not to do this now, you can do this when you have some downtime, but to jot down these categories and then just a note for yourself, what am I already currently doing? And what can I do more of? What can I do that's new? How can I care for myself in new ways or give myself more of this? You might even look at this list and say, is there one of these categories or domains where I feel like I'm struggling more than others? And how can I prioritize that? And so that's an activity I would encourage you to do as a formal way to do some self-care planning. I put this slide in here just as a reference of some small practices you can do throughout the day to cultivate positive emotions. Most of them are pretty explanatory. The one that I like to explain is this idea of pulling weeds and planting flowers. This is this practice that when we have a distressing memory or we're thinking about something that's really upsetting, allowing ourselves to note it and to experience it, and even to respond with some self-compassion, to acknowledge, okay, this was a really hard situation, or I feel really sad, or I'm really hurting. So not to push away unpleasant experiences, to actually acknowledge them and respond with some kindness. But then within the next 30 minutes after having that memory or thinking about that, bring into your mind its exact opposite, an experience where you felt the other way. So if you're thinking about something where somebody made a comment that was hurtful or rejecting, within that next 30 minutes, think of a time where somebody has acted kind towards you or validated you or said something nice. That idea of bringing in the good means that when our mind consolidates that memory, it consolidates those two together. So we start to develop a more balanced view of the world and a more balanced view of our life. This is again, you can kind of read through this on your own. The important part of this slide is that as we go through our daily lives, we accumulate stress, and it can be from physical stress put on our bodies. It could be emotional stress that arises from relationships, or it can be stress that comes from our own thinking. And that we have to actually every day find ways to release the stress from our body. And so at the ways to complete the stress cycle, those are all evidence-based practices that when we engage in them, it actually releases the stress from our body. It lets us return back to our baseline of feeling calm and okay. And so being intentional about doing these practices. If you were to do all those things in one day, physical activity, creativity, laughter, being affectionate or receiving affection, meditation of breath, connecting with other people, allowing yourself to cry when you're sad, that is such a rich and fulfilling day. And it also means that you've allowed that stress to get out of your body. This is my bibliography. Anything that you would like to read more of that I presented on today is referenced here.